joining us on our third Instagram Live workshop of the week. This workshop is titled No Yard, No Problem, Composting in Small Spaces. My name is Michael Martinez. I am the Executive Director of LA Compost, and I have the pleasure of joining you all today at the beautiful regional hub that we partner and collaborate with, Cottonwood Urban Farm. We're here in Panorama City. This location is a drop-off point for residents throughout the week, as well as open hours on Saturdays. Open hours are on pause at the moment. This partnership has been around for about 2 years. It's a beautiful space. This is where the workshop for Please Your Trees was filmed yesterday, and we'd love for you to come by and check it out when we are not forced to stay at home. Today we're going to be discussing four different topics. The first topic is going to center around types of collection that can take place from your personal home or apartment or living space. The second is going to focus on what drop-off options are available if you don't have any space or time or capacity to compost at your own place of living. The third is going to be a brief overview on the process of composting with bokashi. It is something that many of our partner organizations are experts on, and we are just going to briefly provide a quick overview of what that process looks like, how to possibly start that on your own, as well as continue that education and further that knowledge by attending one of their workshops as well. And then we're going to finish the discussion talking about how to compost with worms. I know that's something that might turn a lot of people off, but I think once we explain and demystify the icky or the unknowns of composting with worms, you'll see how easy it is, how beautiful it is, and how wonderful the finished product is that they create. So jumping right in and respecting your 30 to 40 minutes that you have with us, the first thing we want to talk about is if you're living in an apartment, if you're in a home without space and you want to compost, first topic we want to talk about are what options are available to have your material collected. Specifically here in Los Angeles, whether you're viewing here from LA or you're outside of this city or even state, there's a ton of collection options that start from the municipal level all the way down to the small business and nonprofit level as well. Here in Los Angeles, we're involved in a pilot program. The Department of Sanitation has put out a pilot program for a single family home collection. It's around 18,000 homes with the goal of expanding that across all single family homes across the city, 750,000 family homes by the end of 2021, which was listed in the Mayor's Green New Deal. You may have gotten a bucket similar like this if you were a part of that program, and essentially if you are part of that program, again, if you are part of that program, you would put food scraps in here and then dump it in the bucket into your green bin. If you are not part of that program, soon enough, the goal is to partner with the city and allow for the city to offer that to all residents, being thoughtful of how far that material travels and where it goes as well. If you're not part of the city of LA, I know that there's other municipalities throughout LA County as well as throughout the state of California that have pickup options. Obviously, if you're from the Bay Area, specifically San Francisco, you're well aware of Recology's pickup model, but I am going to focus solely on LA because that is the audience I'm hoping that I'm talking to at the moment. Here specifically in LA, we do have one nonprofit that we partner with, and that is Compostable LA. They are specifically on the west side, and they offer a bucket swap program. I think we actually have a bucket here at the farm. If you want to grab it, it's at the far end of the gate, and it's essentially a 4-gallon bucket that they will drop off at your place. You can fill it with food scraps. They'll come pick it up, switch it with an empty bucket, and that bucket actually will be processed here at this farm. They are one of our strong partners. We're coming up almost on a year, and what's great about this model is supporting the local business, keeping the organics local. The compost that we generate from the organics through this collection program are kept on this farm and distributed back to local growers and green spaces. If you're interested in looking up other composters throughout Los Angeles, throughout California, throughout the country, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has this really beautiful map. It's ilsr.org/composting/map. So if you look up Institute for Local Self-Reliance composting map, you'll see a map of all composters from around the country and how you might be able to get involved with them, either via a pickup option or dropping off at one of their locations. Speaking of dropping off at locations, that's what I'm going to kind of jump into next. Here at LA Compost, the bread and butter and the heart of what we've started doing was drop-off model through the form of a community compost hub. Since 2014, we established our first hub at a high school. We now have 33 locations, and obviously we'd love for them to be fully open at the moment, but over the years, some of them have reached capacity, some of them are now co-op models. But whether you're dropping off at one of our compost hubs, or at a partner community garden, or a friend's green space or backyard, there's some tips that we want to share as far as what you can do in your own household prior to dropping off at any of these locations. So as you're preparing your food scraps in the kitchen, oftentimes we have a pail like this or a fancy stainless steel one under the sink or on the counter. And if you have the capacity to dump it every single day or take it to where it needs to go every single day, wonderful. If you don't, oftentimes by day 2 or 3, the bin or the pail starts to smell. You may get some fruit flies, some odors, and it's somewhat unpleasant. One quick tip that we want to offer is the freezer is your best friend. Literally placing this bin, a Pyrex bowl, a Cool Whip container, any reusable container in the freezer, and depositing your food scraps in there does a lot of good. One, it puts everything on pause. It builds up a little bit of frost around the organic material, which water is an ingredient to the compost process. And like me, perhaps you put a water bottle or a glass bottle in the freezer by accident as a child. What happens to that bottle or liquid under cold conditions and temperatures? It expands to the point of it bursting or exploding. Well, thankfully our food scraps aren't exploding in the freezer, but at the microscopic level, the cellular walls and structures literally burst and lose a lot of form. If you put a fresh strawberry in the freezer, take it out the next day and let it thaw, it's kind of mush. Why is that beneficial? Really, really easy for the microbial life to really access and start the decomposition process. So if you're putting your food scraps in your freezer, it's a great option to do that. You can then take it to some of our farmers markets, which we're looking to expand throughout the city as well, our community co-op hubs. And then there's 2 websites as well that we want to share that are kind of nationwide. The first is sharewaste.com. This is a website that allows an individual to create their own little mini hub in their backyard, perhaps if they want to allow for neighbors to drop off. And it allows those neighbors who are wanting to drop off to have access and knowledge of where those neighbors are that are open to that. The second website is makesoil.org. This is a similar website in that it showcases soil makers and soil contributors. If you're a soil maker, you may have a compost bin in your backyard, and you have the capacity to allow for maybe 10 or 15 neighbors. And you could perhaps be one of those 10 to 15 neighbors who then contributes to that soil maker. So Share Waste and Make Soil, as well as our list and maps of hubs, as well as our increasing and growing program of the farmers market, that along with the city's collection programs and their plans of growing, as well as small businesses and multifamily complexes offering compost, I think we're hitting this and we're taking a holistic approach of not just having a one-size-fits-all model, but seeing a lot of options that are available. And I know it's extremely frustrating when if you're living in an apartment complex or a small space or even a home whose green bin doesn't allow for compost or food scraps to be dropped off or deposited, of trying to find a solution. The answer in regards to why doesn't our green bin allow food scraps to be deposited, that is a city question under LA Sanitation, which we are not a part of, but we will answer. And the reason is LA Sanitation takes this material to specific permitted facilities here in and around Los Angeles. And those facilities aren't actually permitted at the moment, and it's very hard to actually get permitted to accept food scrap material. So oftentimes, facilities that are permitted are even outside of our county lines. So oftentimes there's a very far distance that they have to travel. So one of the things that the city's doing is also building new permitted infrastructure, as well as diversifying where that material can be processed. Because food scraps, for all of you that are watching, it's not just waste, it's a resource that we want to reinvest in our neighborhoods. When we've ever experienced the finished product that is compost, you see the beauty and magic that it possesses when it is added to your green space, and the life and value that it adds as well. We briefly went over collection options. We briefly went over drop-off options. One of the things I want to talk about now are the first of 2 methods to compost in your own home. The bokashi process is something that LA Compost really hasn't used in the past. We've had partners in the past such as Epic Renewal and Sustainable Little Tokyo. There's like a bokashi club in Little Tokyo that are phenomenal. We'll make sure we share the May 2nd workshop that's going to take place, that I'll actually teach you the ins and outs of bokashi in a much better way than I could ever do. They'll actually teach you how to make your own bokashi brand and on. But in the composting process, it's material either breaks down through anaerobic fermentation, meaning like with air. So if you've ever made your own kimchi or fermented something, you know it's a sealed jar and it's fermenting, it's without air, and there's specific microbial activity taking place there. If you've ever done it in the backyard with a windrow or a tumbler or a 3-bin system or even a wire bin, you'll know that that's an aerobic process, meaning with air and respiration. The microbial life that are thriving in that pile actually need air to multiply and move and decompose throughout that pile. So the process of bokashi is actually this fermentation anaerobic, so without air. And it's actually relies on an inoculated bran that actually has inoculated microbial activity and microorganisms to actually ferment your kitchen waste. What's really cool about the bokashi process is that it will take the meat, it will take the dairy, it will take a lot of the things that oftentimes backyard composters don't want to take due to like odors and rodents and things like that. So I'm going to do my best to explain the process of bokashi using 2 specific systems. The first system, they are both the same process as in regards to anaerobic fermentation as well as the leachate that is accumulated at the bottom of the bin. One was a DIY home bokashi bin. Shout out to Epic Renewal that gifted this to LA Compost, and shout out to Tom, whose bin this is and is currently active with material. And then we have an all seasons bokashi indoor composter that you can buy from really any online garden retailer for about $50 to $60. Both use an all season bokashi bran as the fermenter that you would apply on. But like I said, the information that we share with Sustainable Little Tokyo, if you attend those workshops, you'll actually get to see how to make your own bran and inoculant. So essentially how it works is there's 2 buckets. The first bucket is a regular Home Depot bucket with holes drilled on the bottom. So as you're placing your food scraps into this first bucket, you would then apply a small amount of the bokashi bran. You would sprinkle that on top. Of the food scraps. And each packet and each specific bin has a recipe in regards to how much you sprinkle and how much you would add. It's about I want to say about 1/3 of a cup of bran each time you apply it onto your food scraps. In the same way in which we work with our compost bin and our 3-bin, you're essentially creating a layer. You have your food scraps, you sprinkle bran, and you close it. You add more food scraps the next day or the same day, you add more bran and you close it. And you're essentially creating a lasagna layer of material of food scraps, meats, bones, dairies, breads, bokashi, and so on. You're going to continue that process. The moisture from the food scraps and the material is going to drain into the second bin. The first bin has holes on the bottom. The second bin is closed with a spigot inserted to be able to capture any of that leachate. That leachate you want to dilute with water. It's super concentrate, and you don't want to just apply that directly to your indoor or outdoor plants. It's also highly acidic, and that leachate will come out. You can capture it with a cup, dilute it with water, and apply that to your plants. This process requires a second step. It's not going to compost entirely in this bin. So as you're layering, it might take you a month, it might take you a week, depending on how much food scraps you're generating. But once the bin is full, I suggest always having 2, so you're never waiting and wondering what to do next. Once this bin is full, you'll cap it off with that bokashi bran, you'll close it, and wait for about a week or 2. After those 2 weeks, many people have different forms of how they trench or add this bokashi to a soil. Some people will dig a hole, deposit this bokashi into that hole and cover it, wait about a month, and then be able to plant directly into that hole where that bokashi was deposited to be able to receive the benefits of all the food scraps and the material that was there. I've heard some people having large flower pots and literally putting the bokashi that had fermented in that flower pot, covering with compost and soil, and then waiting that month and then planting directly into it. I've also seen people who are using the bokashi method at home and will actually bring it to one of our hub sites. One of our hubs is located in Little Tokyo, and the bokashi club out there, I know a lot of the residents that are using the bokashi model will actually deposit this material into our 3-bin system, which is totally fine. If you're going from an anaerobic to aerobic composting, it's totally fine. I think for those in apartments, this is a really great way of at least holding that material for a 2-week period, perhaps even longer, but you do have to think about where this material is going to go. Tom is a close neighbor of mine, and he's actually, if he doesn't have space in his own yard, he's going to trench it in my front yard. There's a lot of community gardens, there's a lot of compost drop-offs, there's a lot of spaces where you can actually inoculate this material and trench it and acclimate it to soil as well. I wouldn't just maybe go and start doing it across all the parks and parkways and green spaces, but you also have permission to do what you like as far as bringing life and adding value back to the soil. Just to show you what this bin looks like, it has a lid, it has a spigot similar to the DIY one. It is one single container that allows for the material to drain to the spigot, and it has a separator here that allows for all the liquid to drain and all the food scraps to stay on top. So although this is one container, that is a DIY 2 5-gallon bin container. This one retails for about $50 to $60, where it takes about $20 to $30 to make that one. I highly suggest, and again, I keep saying we're going to share the information for the Sustainable Little Tokyo Bokashi Club, to attend one of their workshops. That's May 2nd. It's going to be a free event. They actually have a home recipe on how to make your own bokashi brand. I'm going to show you that recipe, and you can screenshot your screen if you'd like, but we will also share this recipe. This is probably the worst way to share information, but if you want to screenshot, please do so now, as far as how to make your own bokashi brand, the ingredients, the supplies needed, and the directions on how to do that. If you didn't get a screenshot or don't know how to, we will share this information and make sure you have access to it as well, okay? So we went over the different collection options, different drop-off options, brief overview of bokashi. The next form of composting that we're going to talk about and end the conversation with, it's going to take a decent amount of time within this period, is composting with worms. Composting with worms is something that we LA Compost have been doing since we started, and it is always a system that we add to our 3-bin system or our windrows or our tumblers, etc. It's an incredible product that you're able to create, and I think what we want to do outside of demystifying worms is really showcase how they work in harmony with your green space, your garden, your compost system, and really anywhere. So I'll start off by saying worms have no eyes, no teeth, no ears. There's literally physically no way they can harm you. They're not going to choke out your pinky, and outside the scary factor of the fact that they feel and look like spaghetti, they're not going to crawl into your shoe drawer or do anything like that. There's many types of worm systems. We're going to show you 3 today. We're going to show you the typical worm system that you'll see at most county, city, municipal workshops. We're going to show you a larger flow-through bin that we at LA Compost have at some of our larger sites. And then we're going to show you how to make your own worm bin at your apartment, house, anywhere where you're located, and how you can actually start keeping food scraps on site, and how those worms can create nutrient-rich compost in the form of their castings. So I'm just going to quickly take the bokashi systems off the table, put the worm bin systems on the table, and we're going to go through that in just a second. So we'll start off by showcasing what a worm bin typically looks like. Oftentimes worm bins are going vertical and keep a small square. They require a small footprint to really function. Worms are a little different in that they are somewhat picky in regards to the environment and conditions that you need to create in order for them to thrive. There's many variety of worms. There are worms that are deep dwellers that'll go 20 plus feet down into the soil. There are some that kind of live and thrive in that foot layer soil, and worms that are surface level worms that are within the first few inches, and those are the worms that we're talking about today. The worms that are specific to compost are often the Acinia fetida, or what we like to call red wigglers. These often come pre-sold by the ½ pound to a pound. They can be shipped directly to your door, or you can attend a city or county workshop and buy live worms for either direct application to your garden or to start your own compost bin. I think one of the largest worm retailers is Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, I think based in Pennsylvania. If you order worms directly from their website, they will ship them pre-fed directly to your door. Or if you want to give your local post office a nice treat, you can have them be held at the post office for a day or two. But just know that you need to open them quickly, you need to place them in the bin quickly and get them going. Worms are both male and female. They breathe through their skin. They are sensitive to light, so it's really important that we keep them in the shade, that we keep them indoors or in really cool, dark places. If you are trying to compost with worms and leaving the bin outside, you are not going to have worms within a few days. So although they require a little bit more upkeep and just attention, the product that you get and the value that you get from composting with worms is really incredible. I'm going to go through this worm bin and how typical worm bins function. I'm going to show you the quick and easy steps how to make one on your own, and then I'm going to show you some of the worm bins that we use here at LA Compost. So this is called the Worm Factory. It is a bin, as I mentioned, that is given away or sold at most city municipal workshops. It has two chambers that have holes underneath, and then it has an enclosed bottom that allows for all the liquid leachate to be captured. So when you're starting a worm bin, you always need to create what we call bedding for the worms. You can't just deposit your worms and start throwing food scraps and expect them to go to work. They actually require bedding to live, move, thrive, and decompose material in. So in my opinion, the ideal bedding is a mixture of quite a few things. There's definitely a spectrum of composters. There's those that are doing the bare minimum and just want to see it happen, and there's the extreme composters. Do what works for you. Don't compare your situation to other composters, because I don't want you to burn out, become uninterested, and I just want you to find value in what works for you in your space. So the materials that I like to use for my bedding are a mixture of coconut core, compost, shredded newspaper. There's some people that like to add rock dust. There's some people that like to use peat moss instead. But peat moss is being used a lot quicker than it is able to grow and regenerate. So I think coco coir is a really great alternative. Coco coir is a waste product. It's a byproduct of the coconut seed. It's all the fibrous, hairy skin. They sell it by the block like this, sometimes bigger, sometimes even in bags at any pet store, any aquarium store. You can even buy it online. This typically ranges like $5 to $7 for a block this size. How to allow for the coconut core to be ready for your compost bin is you would actually place this in a 5-gallon bucket and just fill up the 5-gallon bucket a quarter of the way full. And after doing that, you'll be able to kind of rip and shred the coconut core apart. It'll absorb a lot of the moisture and it'll look like that, almost looking like what finished castings would look like, a lot lighter and a lot more fibers and hair in there. I would deposit the coco core block not in this first bin. Did that incorrectly.
Could you repeat the bedding options again? The wind blew at that time.
Sorry?
The bedding options?
Yeah, the bedding options are coco core, finished compost, a little bit of soil, shredded newspaper or cardboard, making sure you're taking off all the tape, stickers, glues from the cardboard. Yeah, those are some of the options. You do not put the coco core in this frame. You want to put it in the frame with the actual open holes. So I'm just going to show an example of setting my bedding up. I have some coco core. I have some newspaper. Newspaper is great because it'll absorb moisture. The worms will actually break it down. I would prevent putting any junk mail, any paper that has like plastic lining on it, anything like that. You can put shredded eggshells in here as well. Just make sure you're rinsing off the eggshells. And then you're going to want to put some compost, which I'll grab.
You might want to repeat that.
So that's compost, coco core, newspaper, rock dust if you have any. If you don't have finished compost, you could buy garden soil to add to it. As I said, worms don't have teeth, so they use the sand and the grit within the soil, as well as the strength and the muscles in their mouth to help break down the material. You'll want to continue to fill this up about 3/4 of the way full. And you definitely want to make sure that there's some moisture in here. Worms require about 60 to 75% moisture in the bedding material. What that means is if you do the squeeze tech, you should be getting a few drips of water. Within the compost process, within the windrow and 3-bin system, we typically say we want it to be the consistency of a wrung out sponge, not bone dry, not soaking wet, but just damp. Within worm bins, they actually really like the bedding to be somewhat moist. So we want to make sure it's not super dry, and if we're putting newspaper in, we want to make sure it's not 90% newspaper and a little bit of core. There's no exact recipe. I'm sure there's some out there, but I think the learning is in the doing, and it's just kind of like eyeballing it like a recipe. I would add a little bit more compost to this. I would then add about 1/2 pound to 1 pound of worms. Typical rule of thumb is about 1/2 pound to 1 pound of worms per every square foot of worm bin that you're using. So I would put my worms in here. I would make sure that the bin is covered with the lid provided. The lid provided has holes to allow air, to allow the worms to breathe. And the worms, they speak through their movement. So oftentimes when you are starting your worm bin, the first 48 hours, the worms are getting comfortable and used to the space. You might see some worms along the side of the wall. You might see some worms clumping in the corner. They're essentially just getting used to the space and figuring out what's going on. If you purchase them online, they literally were shipped from across the country to your door, put in a new system and home, and they're just figuring things out. I would definitely start to feed them by that day 2. If you're putting finished compost or compost in here, they'll start to further break that material down as well. Some of the things that we can add to the worm bin, and typical rule of thumb is they'll typically eat their half to a full body weight per day. So if you add 1 pound of worms, most people think and assume, all right, I'll put 1 pound of food scraps every single day. Great if that's what it says, but use common sense. Just see how they're breaking it down. If you've added your worms, you're feeding them the next day and they're still working on Monday scraps, don't give them Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Let them continue to break that material down before you start to feed them that next batch. When the worms start to break down the material, the coconut core is going to change in color. This is what the coconut core looks like fresh bedding, and I'm going to show you what some of the harvested castings look like as well. You'll see just a much darker, rich color than the cocoa core, and that's the worms processing that material for a few months. You'll see this bin start to fill up. How this bin is marketed is once this first frame fills up, you then start your bedding on the second frame. That very exact same process I just went through, you can start on this second frame with your cocoa core, your compost or garden soil, your shredded newspaper, and you can actually put some food on this bin. How this bin works is the worms, once you stop feeding that bottom tray, will actually migrate to the top, migrate from the bottom tray to the top. That's how it's supposed to work. I can't make any promises that I've seen it work successfully 100% of the time, but what I like to do is I often like to just feed on one side of the bin. If I'm trying to harvest some of these castings after a month or two, I'll actually feed one side of my worm bin. The worms, after time, will migrate to where that food is, to the point where you can just start to remove and sift and harvest the side that doesn't have any worms. Even with the cover, I like to wet some burlap, wet some newspaper, wet some cotton, and cover my worm bins, especially in the months that we're entering. I think it's supposed to be like 90 something here in LA this week. Last year in September was like triple digits for a few days. The worms do not like or appreciate anything above 80, 85 degrees. That becomes increasingly difficult here in Southern California, as well as South Florida, as well as other areas of the country. So there's different ways to be creative in regards to how you keep your worms cool. They sell worm thermometers online that you can actually stick a little worm thermometer throughout your bin and see the temperature of your worm bin. Keeping your bin nice and moist and in the shade is really important. I've seen some people place ice cubes throughout the worm bin. During some really hot summer months, there's been some really creative ways of freezing water bottles and placing them in the corner of your worm bins to allow the worms to kind of use that as their natural air conditioning. Common Compost up in Oakland is a community composting group that solely focuses on worms and worm bins. I highly suggest you check them out as well. They have some incredible resources and educational tools for you to learn from. County workshops were taking place every Saturday. Unfortunately, those are on pause at the moment. City of LA Sanitation Department was putting workshops on every month. There's still a ton of resources online for you to read up on and learn more about just worm composting in general. If you go to smartgardening.com, there's multiple information sheets that you can download like this that talk about the types of worms, the science of worms, the anatomy of the worm, what they like to eat, what they don't like to eat. Really quick, what we want to avoid in worm bins is meats, dairies, citrus, onions, chili peppers. What they really love is like the avocado pits. I've seen tomatoes. I've seen all types of fruits and vegetables. Unbleached coffee filters are game in here. The worms create a beautiful, rich compost in the form of their poop, which is their castings. And the quote that is listed on this beautiful information sheet from Wendell Berry lists, "If healthy soil is full of death, it is also full of life. Worms, fungi, microorganisms of all kinds. Given only the health of the soil, nothing that dies is dead for very long." I think within the worm bin, you see a lot of death, decay, regeneration. You see that happening in the compost bin. And the worms literally are taking what we no longer need or use and creating something that is beautiful, something that is whole, something that gives life and value back to our green space. So this is the bin that you can purchase at most city and county workshops. I'm going to do a quick 3-minute tutorial on how to build your own if you're trying to do this on a budget with perhaps some materials that you have laying around or you can purchase during the season. So the first thing you're going to need are 2 containers. Typically, most people often use the 10-gallon containers, the 10-gallon Rubbermaid or totes, which are a little shorter. These were available to me, so I'm using these. And you'll want to get 2. The first is going to be where you actually put the bedding, the cocoa coir, the compost, the shredded newspaper in that first one. The second is going to capture any leachate that might come from this bin. With the city bin, it had a little spigot that you can actually release and discharge any of that liquid. With this one, we are just basically allowing that material to leach in the second bin, and we can then dump and empty into our garden. This is more of a leachate versus a direct compost tea. So this is how the bin comes. Obviously, it's an enclosed bin. What I went ahead and did really quickly before the workshop is I simply drilled some holes to allow for the water and any moisture from the food scraps to drain to this bottom bin, okay? You're gonna wanna place this bin in here after you've placed your bedding. You wanna fill this about a quarter of the way full before you place your worms in here. You also wanna make sure you're drilling holes on the roof. So the last thing you wanna do is suffocate your worms. Especially if you've invested in purchasing them to come to your home to start this composting process. But also have grace and compassion for yourself. The reason why we at LA Compost get to teach or even have the platform to teach is because of our collective failures and really learning from those mistakes. The composting process is very forgiving, so never get too down on yourself whether you're working with worms or you're working with larger windrows, because you're going to get something of value if you keep investing and putting that time in. Once you close your bin and you have it set up, again, cool shaded area, keeping it nice and moist. You can wet some burlap, you can wet some newspaper to cover it, and then feed daily, feed every other day, just kind of keep an eye on it. You can have multiple worm bins if you're in an apartment and you have a balcony and some space out there. I've seen people do this under their sink. I understand there's somewhat of a fear factor of having worms indoor, but as long as you start that balance and that routine, you won't really have any issues as far as odors or anything like that. I want to quickly show you some of the worm bins we at LA Compost use for some of our hubs. We give away a lot of the do-it-yourself bins, but we also have what we call a flow-through worm bin. And essentially how that works is we feed the top. There's about 10,000 worms or plus in here, and I'll show you once I uncover it. we are still working with red wigglers here. And we have a cutting bar at the bottom. So as we feed, the material continues to drop. And we have a cutting bar that we run back and forth that allows the castings, or their poop, to fall, which allows us to harvest them. Even in these hot temperatures, the fact that our worm bin is nice and moist, nice and covered, nice and fed, you see a healthy population of worms all throughout this bin. We actually feed these worms pre-composted material because the worms are part of that soil food web that really break down some of the other fungi, bacteria, nematode, protozoa within that soil food web. So from our windrows, we'll actually sift this material at our sifting station, and then the food that we get is this beautiful pre-composted material that we can also feed some of our worms, in addition to fresh food scraps that some residents are dropping off as well. So we feed them throughout the week, we water, we keep it moist, and we harvest maybe once or twice a month, or even more frequently, depending on how quickly this bin is filling up. If you ever see little yellow balls, those are worm eggs, which will have worm babies. I don't want to dig too deep in here, but just by rubbing my hand all throughout this worm bin, it is very populated and very happy. Some things to think about when you're composting with worms is your bin could either be too wet or too dry. It could be too hot or too cold, or there could be too little or too much food. And outside of that, you could really keep a healthy balance of what's going on in your worm bin. I've seen some people have some issues with ants. If they have their bin outside under a tree in a cool shaded area, some ants actually have come into their bin and actually competed for their food. There's different creative ways to remediate that issue. You can use diatomaceous earth, which is like DE, which is just a natural mineral you can find at most garden stores, and sprinkle that around the base of the legs of your worm bin, or even in your worm bin, and you won't really harm any of the worms in there. You're not going to kill the ants, it's more of an irritant exoskeleton. I've seen some people put the legs of their worm bins in like cups or bowls of water. I've seen some people put cayenne pepper or cinnamon around the legs of their worm bin. But yeah, there's different creative ways to ensure that your worms are healthy, happy, and you will lose worms. Worms are going to die, they're going to decompose in the bin, but they're also going to repopulate and balance out that overall population that you have in your system. So that's that. I guess we can answer a few questions, and then we're going to call it a day, and thank you for your time.
Back to the fireside chat.
We can actually have them email their questions.
Okay, let's see.
Why don't we do this? If you have any questions in regards to any of the workshops you were a part of this week, from the tree care and pruning to the soil health and soil building early in the afternoon, to the worms and composting in small spaces, please email us at info@lacompost.org. Again, that is info@lacompost.org, and we will share the Bokashi workshop links, the Make Soil Share Waste links, the ILSR Find a Composter link, and any of the information that you might have missed. Just please let us what you'd like to know. Write your question in that email, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you again.
So